Hello and welcome. And I'm here today with Dr. Sarah Ganty, who is a leading expert in immigration, human rights, rule of law issues within the European Union. And so those are some of the topics we're going to talk about today. And, immigration, if we can start with that, immigration, asylum, these are really highly contentious, highly political, often highly controversial areas, right, in politics, and the European Union is no exception there. But I suppose I could start by asking you, what are the EU's responsibilities in this area? Or is immigration and asylum, is that something that's mainly for each individual member state to deal with? So what kind of powers does the EU have in this area?
First, thank you for having me, Mikael. This is really a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the audience, to the audience as well. So maybe, yes, indeed, immigration, asylum is an extremely contentious issue at EU level. And something we should keep in mind is that the EU is competent in immigration and asylum law. What does it mean is that since the signature of the Lisbon Treaty, there is now what we call the common immigration and asylum policy. But of course, this didn't kind of materialize in one day. Since Maastricht, the competencies of the EU has kind of evolved. And today we really see the EU basically building a legal framework regarding all what concerns the borders, the visa, the resident statuses, but also the rights that third country nationals can claim within the EU. So the EU is competent in the field of immigration and asylum law, but member states are still the one issuing the visas, issuing the resident statuses, etc. But they have, of course, to respect the legal framework set up by the EU.
Okay, so, we have these kinds of layers of law, right? We have the member states who are still, as you say, competent in these areas and who issue visas and who make decisions about who can and cannot become a citizen. And then EU law kind of overlays that, right, with a layer of protections, perhaps, rights, perhaps, duties, perhaps. So, at the moment...
If I can give you some examples, for instance, when someone wants to claim asylum, of course, we have the Geneva Convention, the international law, but then we have all the EU directive, what we call the qualification directive, which explains what criteria the member states have to take into account when assessing an asylum claim, for instance. And these the member states have to respect. This is binding law by the member states.
Okay, so each member state then, there's a somewhat uniform system of judging who does and doesn't qualify for asylum. Another important aspect of the EU's asylum system framework, if you will, is the so-called Dublin regulation, right? And people may have heard of that. So could you please explain a little bit about what is that? What is the Dublin regulation? What does that entail?
So the principle behind the Dublin regulation is that basically the first country of arrival is the first country which has to deal with the asylum claim, which explains why Italy and Greece got a bit overloaded with all the asylum claims, since Dublin regulation says that the first country of arrival is the one which deals with the asylum claims, and then means that you have all the receptions directive applying. So how you have to welcome asylum seekers, how to have to deal with the asylum claim, and then how to have to treat refugees once they got this asylum recognized, the asylum rights recognized.
Okay. Yeah. And so this has created all sorts of tensions and problems within the European Union in many ways, right? And I think, you can say that you have this situation where amongst the member states, you could divide them into countries that are so-called frontline countries, and you mentioned Italy and Greece, right? And there are others where the bulk of asylum seekers tend to first arrive. And then the so-called countries of secondary migration, right? Which is, say, places like France or Germany or Sweden, right, where asylum seekers may prefer to be compared to Italy or Greece, right, and would be trying to get there. But one of the fundamental problems is that this sets up, these two groups of countries have different interests, right, in terms of what they want out of the asylum system. And I guess a theme that, we can get into a bit more as well is, the EU proclaims certain values, and then we always see in practice the tensions and the limitations of these values, right? So one of the values is solidarity. That the member states should show solidarity with one another. But this has been a problem, right, in trying to find a solution or a framework that works both for frontline states and for the countries of secondary migration, that there's a lack of kind of practical solidarity, would you say?
Yeah, and it was a huge issue, especially in the aftermath of 2015, the so-called like refugee crisis, and there was this council decision about like the relocation of asylum seekers in a lot of countries, including Hungary, for instance, like refused to take their share in and even like disputed and went in front of the Court of Justice to request that the decision get annulled. The Court of Justice said that the decision was illegal and that basically Hungary, which was supported by Poland, like had to respect these decisions, but in the end, like Hungary didn't relocate any asylum seeker here. So indeed, solidarity is a huge issue. But I think that solidarity is a big issue. But here we speak about the relationship between member states, and I think we also need to ask like what the system is at EU level and what's happening at the borders. And I think it's we tend to focusing on this question of solidarity, how member states should share the burden, but I don't think it's a burden, but this is how it is presented, and I think it's also feed all the populist discourse. In a sense, we need to ask ourselves, but how the EU, how does it work at EU level? And here maybe like we can speak later about the concept of lawlessness now, but I think that we tend to probably forget about the essential and about like about the fact that these people are human beings and have individual rights which are totally denied right now. So speaking about solidarity, it's an important issue, but I think first we need to speak about like what's happening at the borders and what the EU has built, what we call lawlessness now, in order to make sure that that the fact that migrants are denied any kind of individual right is not considered as a violation of EU law.